snow moved like a patient army across the yard of Castle Black, cohort upon cohort of flakes marching to fill every track with white forgetfulness. The old stones drank it and grew smooth. The wind combed the ramparts, found the tiniest cracks in doors and cheeks and sent its cold fingers there. Men worked with hunched shoulders and sullen faces, boots thumping, breath smoking. But the wall looked at all of them as if from the far end of time and did not change. Jon Snow read the letter by the glow of a brazier and the twitching flare of a torch in an iron sconce. The king's seal had been broken by Donal Noy before the man died, but the script was unmistakably tight and neat with a pinched severity that felt like Stannis Baratheon's mouth pressed to parchment. Words can cut, Jon thought, and these were as sharp as a newly whetted blade. The offer was simple and startling. His father's name, the seat stolen from a boy's corpse and set upon by wolves in men's skins. Winterfell legitimized, granted by royal decree. The king in the narrow sea would make the bastard of Winterfell a Stark, and with the name would come a duty that had always been whispering to Jon in the clatter of the yard at Winterfell, in the soft sough of the weirwood leaves, in the quiet way his father looked at him when the hall grew noisy and the world far away. Stannis's words made him cold, and not from the wall's breath. He listened to the wind and to Ghost breathing at his feet, heavy and steady. The direwolf's fur blended into the snow drift that had formed near the door. Only the eyes were alive, two coals banked red under ash. Jon folded the letter once and again and slid it into his belt. The God's Wood of Castle Black was a pocket of old trees that had survived frost and fire, and its weirwood had a face cut deep into it long before the wall rose. He walked there as he had walked to the heart tree in Winterfell when he was a boy. He walked as if the motion might carve a groove in the earth that would lead him back to a life already gone. The breath froze in his nostrils and the iron on his scabbard bit into his hip like teeth. The heart tree bled crimson sap in frozen beads that caught the moonlight like rubies on a dead queen's gown. The face in the bark looked upon him without judgment. It had watched so many oaths taken and broken, so many bones buried that the memory of any one man must be as faint as mist on a lake. He put his palm against the cold bark. Somewhere beyond the wall the dead walked. Somewhere south of it the living flayed each other. He could feel time pulling him in both directions. "My duty is here," he said, and the wind took his voice and pinned it like a moth along the black edge of the forest. Then he remembered the last time his father's hand had rested on his shoulder. A quiet squeeze that said more than words. Be the man you were meant to be, even if the world offers you another. He remembered Arya racing up the steps two at a time, Bran asking questions that stacked like piled stones, Robb laughing at Grey Wind's clumsy gallop through the straw, Sansa singing in a corner with Septa Mordain nodding sternly, and even Rickon with his fists and his stubborn chin. A pack, father had said once, perhaps to Robb alone, perhaps to all of them in some memory Jon had stolen and made his own. The lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. It was a stark saying. It tasted of smoke and cold broth and the old bones of the north. He knelt. "I took my vows," he told the face carved by some nameless, patient hand. "Cold or warm, hungry or fed, loved or hated, I took them. Yet Stannis writes with his iron hand, and my blood rises like water in a spring when I think of Winterfell. Father, I am torn." He waited. The leaves did not move, for there was little wind here and the snow weighed them down. He listened to his own pulse, to ghosts, to the hush that grew soft and large in his ears. No voice answered him, so he brought the matter to himself as he had learned to do at the wall. Weigh what is in your hands, not what might have been. The others were real. So were starving villages in the gift, and the mothers who traded heirlooms for turnips, and the way silence seemed to deepen when the cold grew more cruel, as if the world were drawing in its breath. The north had been set upon by wolves in men's skins. The Boltons had been raised to lordship over bones and lies. If Winterfell stood again with a dire wolf upon its banners, it would be more than pride. It would be a signal fire in the howling dark. He felt the old words stir inside him like coals finding a gust. Winterfell is the hearth. Down in the yard, axes bit at timber and men cursed. The wall slept beside them, a great pale beast that seemed to stir when a cloud shadow passed. Jon rose and turned. He did not make his decision at the tree. He had made it at Winterfell when Ned Stark had placed Longclaw in his boy hand in a yard of quiet men and told him that honor was choice and cost. He had made it when he had told Sam to go south with Eamon. He had made it when he had put his palm on Ghost's head the night before they rode to the Fist. The vow did not break. It shifted shape to meet the mountain of what must be done. He went first to Stannis Baratheon, because a choice should be set upon an anvil and hammered until it rang true or broke. The king's solar was cold. Stannis did not warm rooms. He cooled them with his presence and his insistence upon reality's hard edges. A brazier glowed and the Red Woman stood near it, her shadow moving as if it lived a different life from the body that cast it. Stannis stared at maps pinned with iron nails, his jaw set so tight that Jon thought if a smith struck it with a hammer, sparks would leap. "You have read my letter." Stannis did not waste greetings. "I have." Jon looked at the flags pricked into weather-stained parchment. The Dreadfort's flayed man, the Merman of White Harbor, the Tree of the Risswells, the Moose of the Hornwoods, the crowned stag that Stannis persisted in planting across the north as if it were a crop. A dire wolf had not been claimed by any hand here. And Stannis's mouth barely moved. Jon looked at him and saw the man the wall would meet if the wall had hands. Unbending, unforgiving, the strength of iron and its refusal to change shape unless melted in fire. "I will take the name if your grace's word is iron," he said, "and I will take the duty with it, but I will not take it as a bauble." The Red Woman's eyes warmed like banks of coals stirred. "The Lord of Light favors boldness, Lord Snow." "I am not your lord," Jon said gently, because gentleness was a kind of power here, and he would need power enough to make men bend without breaking them. "But perhaps someday I will be Winterfell's." Stannis nodded once, a smith acknowledging a blade that might take an edge. "The Night's Watch. I cannot be both." The words ran a splinter's length ahead of hesitation and pain. "I took my vows and I have kept them. No lands, no wife, no crown. The oath is old and it stands. But you claim the Iron Throne, your grace. By that claim you may release men from fealty. Will you release me from mine?" Stannis turned to the brazier and held his hands over it as if to seize warmth that refused to give itself. "You ask me to break your vows for you. I ask you to make them other than they are," Jon said. "The realm is not safe while Winterfell is a name men spit. If the wall must stand, then the north must stand with it. Ghost does not hunt alone in winter." The king's lips twisted. It might have been approval in a harsher man. "You have a soldier's tongue when you choose." The Red Woman watched mutely, the gems at her throat catching firelight like captured stars. Stannis waved her nearer. "You spoke to me of this boy," he said, "of shadows you saw in your flames." Melisandre's eyes were green fire for a breath. "I saw a white wolf in the snow with a gray sword in his mouth," she said. "I saw him at a high place and then beneath the earth among stone kings and queens. I saw him bite the hand that fed him, and the hand bled winter. I saw him stand when the flames went out." Stannis made a sound that might have been impatience wrapped around curiosity. "This is the language of fools and priests. Yet," he looked at Jon again, measuring a man as he would measure a beam, whether it could bear weight. "I will call you Jon Stark in letter and in law. I will name you Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North when the North comes to heel. The raven will fly before noon, and I will say this as well. Whatever men grumble in their cups, they will not dare gainsay me in the open, not while I hold Lightbringer in my hand. But know this, if you fail, I will set another in your place." Jon bowed. "I mean for no one else to be needed." "And the watch?" Stannis asked. "Will Bowen Marsh weep? Will he try to hang you with your own words?" "He will be angry," Jon said, thinking of the soft white of Bowen's cheeks when the wind bit him and of the careful way the man counted sacks of oats. "He will name me Oathbreaker. Some others will as well. But the old bear would have understood." He swallowed the name. The old bear had died on a dirty floor in a different winter. "If we hold the north, we hold a shield before the wall. I would not leave them for something less." "Go then," Stannis said. "Take a company. I can spare no more than a sword's width of men. Do not look at me so, boy. I have battles to fight that you have not even seen, and every man's life is a buttress in my hand. You will take Massey and Horp and a third of Godry's men. I will send to the clans. The Wools and Littles and Norreys have old debts to your house. My letters will carry weight, and your face will add the stones we need. You will not wait for me to hold your hand. If you set the wolf upon Winterfell's walls, I will come behind you with fire. And food, Jon asked, because honor starves if you cannot feed your men. The granaries are empty from the Ironborn, and what little the Boltons did not burn, winter will eat. Stannis's mouth was a grim line. White Harbor will send grain if I ask, and I will ask. The Manderleys love their bellies. They will love mine for a time if I fill theirs more. We will need more than grain to hold a fortress. The weather is not my ally. He looked past Jon at the wall as if he could see through stone and ice and night to a road worth marching. You will ask help where I cannot. Tame what wildlings you can. That is your work. Hold the damned castle. Melisandre's smile was as thin as a drawn thread. And beware the flayed men when you sleep. I will sleep with my sword, Jon said. He bowed again and left, feeling as if each step drew a line in the snow between what he had been and what he would be. They called the brothers to the common hall. It was always cold there, even when the fires were banked high. The smoke wandered like a wounded thing among the rafters and would not find its way out. Bowen Marsh stood near the door to mark every man who entered. Dolorous Ed wore his usual expression of a man who had been left an estate made entirely of old boots. Satin pressed his lips together, not wanting to smile at the wrong time. Gren and PYP were gone to the Shadow Tower. News traveled slowly in winter, and friendship more slowly still. Jon climbed onto the dais where the Lord Commander would sit to address them. He had sat there once, after Sam's cleverness and by the will of men who now watched him with narrowed eyes. He set his hands on the rough wood, feeling the nicks and burn marks. I called you to hear me, he said. You know what I am and what I have sworn. You know I have kept my oath as well as any man can or better, though I have not always done so in a way you liked. A murmur flicked among them like small birds startled in reeds. But the king has offered me Winterfell, and I have accepted. Bowen Marsh made a strangled sound. Janos Slint, sour and thick as old stew, said, a bastard's appetite. Jon looked at him without heat, and the way Janos flinched made some of the men straighten, as if smoke had lifted from their eyes. A man's duty, Jon said, and my duty is the wall as much as yours. But a dead North will not send us men or food. A Bolton warden will not reinforce the forts or care whether the dead ride down the King's Road. A Stark in Winterfell draws the North to him, and the North will stand when the storm comes. I will be that Stark. You cannot, Bowen said, red in the face, take lands. It is forbidden. You know the words. They were spoken at the first sunset after the wall was raised, and they have not been silenced. Stannis Baratheon releases me from my vows, Jon said. He does it as king. If you say he is not king, call Tommen the usurper then. But will Tommen hold the wall? Will Roose Bolton hold it? If you tell me my oath cannot be unbound by a king, I will tell you that the Watch has always bent to a king's need. We were made to serve the realm. The realm needs the North to live. Words, Janos Slint sneered. Pretty words for a Stark boy playing at being his brother. Jon stepped down from the dais. He crossed the floor without haste. Each step another ring of silence. He stopped close enough to smell the onions Janos had eaten. Longclaw, he said. Ghost was a white weight at his heel. He did not raise his voice. In that, he sounded less like a boy, more like Ned. Do you remember what happened to another man who mistook my words for a toy? Slint's eyes slid past him. He was a man who had learned where power ran by watching where men's eyes went. Now every eye in the hall seemed to be a storm lantern, and Jon felt the weight of them all. He did not touch his sword. We are brothers, he said, speaking to the hall more than to the man in front of him. If you call me Oathbreaker, know that I have weighed the cost of breaking my oath against the cost of keeping it. I will carry it. I will not ask you to pay it. But my leaving is not treason to the watch. It is aid to it. I will carve a shield out of my father's wooden bones and hold it in front of the wall." He did not say more about blood. Men who did not know did not need telling, and men who did not need reminding. He walked away to the unhappy calls of men who had loved him or hated him, and the more terrible silence of men who were not sure which it was. He left at dawn under a high pale sky that looked like bones scraped clean. Stannis gave him 80 heavy-footed knights of his queen's men, who broke the conqueror's laws with their prayers and his own with their zeal. They were hard fighters and uneasy riders in snow. Justin Massey rode with an easy grace and a coin's greed. Richard Horpe had a blade's impatience. Godry Faring's humor was cruel but his sword arm honest. From the wildlings came fewer than Jon had hoped and more than he had a right to expect. Tormund sent a knot of archers whose faces were North Wind and Old Smoke, along with a handful of boys with iron in their eyes who had never seen a castle that did not try to eat them. A then or two walked among them like bronze statues wearing scars. Alice Karstark stood straight in a patched wool cloak and stared the queen's men down as if daring them to object to her presence. At her side strode her betrothed Sigorn of the Vens. Taller than any of the knights and less impressed by them than the wind was by their banners. They took the hunters' paths and the low roads through the Wolfswood. They did not use the King's Road because men were looking for any sign of Stannis' hand, and they did not want to show them this one. They moved like frost under bark. They slept in ruined crofters' huts or under pines thick enough to hold the snow at bay. Jon walked more than he rode, feeling the north under his boots. It was both empty and full, a vastness that held old stories like seeds. At night, by starlight or the ember glow of banked fires, he talked to Alice of Carhold and of her uncle who had tried to sell her like a mare. He listened to Sigorn speak of valleys choked with snow and men who knew the sun more as a story than a friend. He took counsel with Massey on coin and with Horpe on scouts and sent Ghost ranging wide with one of the silent wildlings. The dire wolf came back with blood on his muzzle more than once. There were wolves in the Wolfswood again, bolder now that men had thinned with war. Before they came in sight of Winterfell's towers. No, not towers. Stumps of towers, black with old fire. Jon smelled her. Winterfell had a scent that had little to do with whatever men did to her. It was old stone warmed by kitchens, iron that had tasted rain, earth turned for centuries in gardens and in graves. He felt it before any man's cry announced the crest where the castle would reveal herself. He crested it on foot, Ghost a pale ghost indeed at his side, and stood with the breath stopped in his throat. She was wounded and proud, both. The wooden palisades the Ironborn had raised were black stubble now. The towers that had been boys' ladders seated with dreams were faceless and collapsed. The broken bridge still arched like a cut tendon. Smoke stains marred the walls in wide sickle swathes. Yet the walls stood around a heart that still beat. The Godswood's red leaves showed above snow like spilled wine. The towers turned what remained of their faces toward him as if to say, "Late, but you came." They entered to no bugles and to the flitter of ravens. Snow had drifted against posterns and choked courtyards. It had taken rooms for itself and made beds out of old rushes. The great oak doors of the hall were open and leaned crookedly. A broken hinge lay rusting like a fallen thong. Jon walked into the hall where once his father had dispensed justice with a stern mouth and a gentle hand. He felt his throat close. His footfalls echoed unopposed. He and Godry Faring pushed the doors to the kitchens and found them quiet, the hearth a black jaw waiting for bread. He sent men to clear flues and pile wood. He sent others to find the well and break the ice that now sealed it. He knelt by the hearth and laid Longclaw before it and pressed his palms to the stones. "Light a fire for me," he said softly to the hall, to the spirit of the place, to whatever had watched the Starks from the oldest days. "If you do, I will keep it burning." In the end, it was a small fire that began it. Birch twigs, the fat wood they had brought in a pack, a breath that coaxed. Then a lick of flame catching on a curl of resinous wood. Then more, the crackle of damp logs as smoke took to the unpracticed chimney and went upward with grudging grace. Men gathered with their hands outstretched as if the flame might pause and need their encouragement. In the afternoon Jon went to the godswood alone, though Ghost padded behind at just the distance between heart and breath. The snow there was still and deep and did not glitter the way spring snow sometimes did. It lay like a soft sentence. The heart tree's face regarded him with the ache of centuries. He knelt, feeling the cold creep into his bones and welcome him as if he had been made from it. He did not speak long. Words felt thin in the godswood. He pressed his palm to the bark and for a moment felt a pulse. His own, the trees, the castles. The weirwood sap was frozen in red beads that seemed to catch at the pale sunlight like small hearts caught under ice. He did not ask for forgiveness. He asked for strength. By nightfall the kitchens clanged like a smithy and the hall smelled of broth. The queen's men dragged benches into order and cuffed boys who ran too fast. But they warmed themselves without shame and did not forbid the wildlings to take meat. Alice sat quietly with a bowl between her hands and watched the flames as if seeing there her father's halls at Carhold and the rows of men who would not come again. Jon took his own bowl and sat near the hearth on a low stool his feet remembered. He did not send for a chair. They slept in blankets in rooms that had held stark bones and laughter. In the morning men set to work as if the work itself would keep them from sinking into the snow. They cleaned the cisterns and scraped old smoke from the stones. They set men on the walls and sent boys into the granaries with torches, and there found nothing but a few mice who had made their winter palaces among husks. They mended doors with wood taken from the ruin of outbuildings and from the small forest of wagons that had died in the yards during the Ironborn's joy. Winterfell woke slowly and rubbed a gaunt hand across her face, learning the shape of morning again. Ravens flew with Jon's words in their claws. He sent them to White Harbor and Deepwood Motte and Last Hearth. He sent to Oldcastle and Torrens Square. He sent one to Barrowton that he did not expect to be answered and one to the Dreadfort that he expected to be answered with cloth dyed red by someone else's skin. The words were not long and not elegant. He said, "Winterfell holds." He said, "Come if you will stand under the dire wolf and be counted." He said, "The king in the narrow sea recognizes the North's ancient rights." He did not say the king's name more than once. Men in the North knew it and they would not be warmed by repetition. White Harbor's reply came first, fat with polite words and heavy with implication. Lord Wyman wrote from a bed piled with quilts, if the slant of his ink could be believed. He sent thanks for Jon's vigilance, concern for the winter roads, and a promise of flour when the river allowed wagons to climb the banks. He offered prayers for the health of Lord Jon Stark of Winterfell, the first time Jon saw his father's name written behind his own, and he read it 3 times, then put it away as one might a precious knife. But between the lines were hints of caution. White Harbor had bent a knee to the Bolton warden. White Harbor sent men to their wedding. White Harbor had sons in captive hands. A man cannot turn a table too quickly without spilling his soup. The second reply was a rider, not a raven. Snow flurried around him and clung to the edges of his brows like frost to old thatch. He was old himself, bigger than most men, with shoulders like an ox's yoke. He had white beard enough for 2 men, and the cold had painted the veins in his cheeks in thin blue forks. He brought 6 men with him, and 12 boys in the kind of clothes that said a winter of raiding had fed them better than any lord's kitchen. "Crow food?" Justin Massey whispered, as if naming a bear might make it turn its head. "Moor's umber," Jon said aloud. The old man swung down out of the saddle with a grunt. He smelled of horse and pine pitch and old snow. "The Greatjon's whelp," he said, squinting his left eye and clearing his right with a thumb. "No, not Rob, the quiet one. You grown enough to make trouble then?" "I'm grown enough to hold my father's hearth," Jon said. He went down a step and offered his hand. The old man took it, feeling the grip as if it were a branch he might trust over a river. "Winterfell welcomes the Umbers." "Does it?" Moore said, and barked a laugh like a dog surprising itself. "I thought she had forgotten the word. Roose Bolton keeps little store by welcoming. But I've had enough of flayed men. You fixed the doors to shut the winter out." "We're fixing them," Jon said. "Good." Moores clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to bruise. "Snow's thick in the wolfswood. Better to be behind a wall than under a drift. I'll show you where the wind finds your arse if you've forgotten." They walked the walls together. Moors told him which parapets iced first, where carts had slid and killed men when the cobbles were wrong, where the wind would steal the tenderness from a babe before her mother realized she had died. Winterfell was a living thing to the Umbers as it was to the Starks, a creature of drafts and echoes as much as stone and iron. He left Jon with a promise that more boys would come and a mutter about how his brother Hother sat on a chair like a hen sits on a cold egg. 2 days later they found Theon Greyjoy's ghost whipped by a north wind and wrapped in rags, leaning against the shadow of the eastern gatehouse. Ghost had found them first and would not let the direwolf close, and Jon knew why before he saw the face under the hood. Theon's eyes were full of ashes. The lines about his mouth had been carved by knives and guilt. He held the waist of a girl whose breath came too shallow and thin. Her hands were purple where her fingers had cracked with cold. They had come alone. That was a courage none of the Ironborn had taught. That courage was his own, perhaps born of fear. Theon looked up at the gate as if at the door of a church where he knew he would not be welcome. "Winterfell," he said hoarsely, "I've come back." Jon stared down from the parapet. He had thought sometimes in spare moments of meeting Theon again. Not the Theon who had laughed too loudly and tossed a knife to catch it by the tip and looked to see if women saw him, but this one, the one he had become. In his quieter imaginings, he had measured the justice against the need and found the weight never settled. He descended, slow as winter itself. The men at his shoulders watched him with faces ready. Godry faring spat into the snow, a judgment. Jon stopped 2 paces away and looked at Theon without speaking. Theon shivered, his mouth trembling with cold and something else. The girl, too thin, her brown hair clotted with ice, swallowed and swayed. "She," Theon said. His voice scraped. "She is, or was called, Arya." Jon's gaze snapped to the girl. He had seen Arya in dreams, dirty and fierce, with a blade short and quick. The girl stared back at him like a hunted thing. There was no Stark in her bones. He knew it before his mind named it. His heart was a careful animal then, wrapping its tenderness away from the cold. "She's not," he said, his voice even. "But she is a girl and she is freezing. Bring them in." Theon sagged like a rope that had been cut. Godry hissed through his teeth but stood aside. They took the girl. Jane, Jon learned in whispered, broken words, into the hall and put hot stones at her feet and wrapped her in blankets. They brought bone broth and sweetened it a little with the last of a cask of late autumn cider, and the girl cried soundlessly as the warmth went through her and hurt. Theon sat on a bench near the fire but not close enough to take comfort from it. He watched Jane as if by watching he might keep knives from her. Jon sat opposite him. For a time he said nothing. Then, "Tell me," Theon told him in a voice that had been threshed and left to dry. Dreadfort cellars, Ramsay's hands, the wedding in a burned hall, Frey's drinking beside flayed men. How he had climbed with Jane in the snow and the cold cut like razors. How the dogs howled like love songs from hell. How the boy he had been had died in so many ways that not even the gods could count them. Jon listened and made no sound. When Theon ran out of words, the hall listened with him to the fire's low talk. "You will die for what you did here," Jon said finally, as if stating the weather. Theon nodded without protest. "But not today." Theon looked up at him then with a look so naked with gratitude that Jon had to look away. "Not while the man who made you into this breathes." The relief was a blow. Theon swayed. "Roose," he said, as if naming a ghost. "His son first," Jon said. "Ramsay means to come and bend this hall to his knives. He threatens with more skill than he fights. But men who fear him will fight fiercely because they fear. We will make them fear something else." Theon's laugh was a broken thing that nonetheless had the memory of boyish mockery in it. "You always were a Stark," he said, "even when you were only called Snow." Jon rose. "Rest. Eat. You will tell me what you know of their ways with ladders and fire." He looked to Jane where she slept now, her breath warmer. "And she will keep her name." Janos Slynt would have objected to any wildling in his hall. Godry might have objected to any Ironborn. Jon ignored their objections. He gave orders the way he had learned at the wall. Briefly, clearly, in the order in which they were to be done. He set thens to the rubble where men would flag, because the thens loved resistance as other men loved meat. He sent Mors Umber and his raiders to harry any party that looked like a Bolton scout near the King's Road, and told them specifically to let some men live to carry fear back. He asked Alice to put pen to parchment to write to Carhold in her hand, one letter for love and one for anger, decided by which Uncle read first. He sent a raven to the Shadow Tower with a message for a man he trusted there. The wall should watch its back because the night was growing full of men as well as other things. For 2 weeks winter tested them. The sky went leaden and refused to break. The men's feet grew white and then purple, and then they learned to bind them properly. The bread ran low and men learned to make a kind of cake from acorn flour that tasted like regret. Some ate it gladly anyway. Winterfell's heart warmed a little each night, and men began to smile with half their mouths again. Ghost hunted in the Godswood and near the smoking pools. He brought back rabbits and once the head of a fox. Jon took each gift and thanked the giver, cutting the meat carefully with a bone-handled knife that had been Mickon's in another life. Godry's men began to say, "My lord," with less stiffness and more calculation. The wildling boys learned that the yard had a sound different from the open ground when a blade fell on it. The yard learned that wildlings listen like cats. In the 3rd week, men on the outer wall called down to the yard, and the yard called to the hall, and the hall threw its noise outward like a stone thrown into snow. Riders. Snow plumed at their horses' hooves in long, cold banners. White banners. A fat man's face in green. Knots of men on shaggy northern horses as comfortable in the cold as oxen in straw. At their head came a banner with a white merman on a field of blue-green, and a second with a white knife rimmed with frost. Wyman Manderley did not ride out himself, for the roads would have killed him if the gods and his own weight did not. But his banner did, and under it rode Ser Marlon Manderley, red-cheeked and stern, and Ser Simon with a jaw like a chopping block, and between them a narrow man with eyes like a moneylender's ledger. Davos Seaworth, leaner than Jon remembered from Stannis' hall and wearing the salt as a knight wears scars. Davos swung down from his horse, his boots sinking to the ankle. "My lord," he said, "I bring White Harbor's flour and fish and salt beef as far as men can drag wagons through ruts." "You bring hope," Jon said, taking his arm with both hands. Davos's mouth pulled into what might be called a smile if one were generous and had not seen smiles for a long time. "It is bought dear," Davos said low. "Freys watch us and Bolton's count sacks. But men in White Harbor have long memories and longer knives." Manderley's knights knelt in the snow actually, as if the gesture must be paid for in cold. Jon bid them rise, gave them hot wine, and set the kitchens to work as if the king himself had arrived. In private, with Davos and Massey and Alice and Umber and Melisandre, for the Red Woman had come with Stannis' men and remained like a coal that refused to die, they spoke in a circle where words could be measured and laid upon the board like pieces. "Roose Bolton will not wait," Davos said. "He sends word to men who would rather not hear it, and some will obey because the knife in their backs is closer than the one in yours." "Roose is a spider," Umber rumbled. "His son is a dog. I prefer dogs. You hit them and they learn faster." "He will bring Freys," Davos said, making a face as if he had bitten green fruit. "They are loud and ambitious and stupid, which is a weapon in its way." "Stupidity goes where courage hesitates," Melisandre murmured. "And Manderley?" Jon asked. "Your lord will speak with his stomach?" "He will speak to his stomach until such time as he can speak with his hands." Davos's mouth flattened. "He sent me to tell you that the White Harbor men wish their fat lord to live long enough to see his grandchildren. That means caution. But he sent me also to tell you that he remembers little Wendell and knows where his bones rest." "They belong here," Umber said. "They belong in a story men will remember when their grandchildren ask them why they are allowed to sleep under blankets," Davos said. Jon looked from one to the other and saw a web begin to glow like frost under moonlight. He saw lines of allegiance, old debts, grudges stone hard. "We will not make Winterfell a feasting hall," he said. "We will make it a fortress, and we will make it a hearth for those who dare its fire." He looked to Mors. Let the umbers raid and be seen to raid. Take banners. Let the phrase count them twice. We want them angry and sure of themselves. You are your father's whelp, Moore said, but there was a rough goodwill in it, as in a man complimenting the steel in another's blood. And Ramsay? Davos asked. The name felt like a cold nail in the air. Men moved as if they heard his dogs yelping at the sound. Jon's face went still. Theon Reek, he was called. Says Ramsay loves night approaches, that he cannot keep his hands off a siege that he might dirty them in. He has boys who like to play with torches more than hammers. He will try to burn us out. He will try to climb where he ought to batter. He will be impatient and sure. That is where we kill him. He could feel the hall listening beyond the door. Word would spread as it should. He did not forbid it. Let men chew the name in their mouths and spit it out or swallow it like medicine. The siege began with a letter. Pink waxen words scratched in a boy's hand that had learned to hold a quill as one holds a knife. The messenger was a forester who had not been paid enough to make himself unreadable. He flinched when Godry Faring shouted for him to be silent and nearly wept when Jon asked him softly whether he was hungry. He gave up the letter and ate salt fish as if it might beat his fear. Jon read it by the window where the winter light made a thin blade on the page. Bastard, it began, as if the word were a bead of prayer. Bastard, bastard, I have your hall and I want your head for its nail. He smiled without showing his teeth. The letter was full of boasts about wolves skinned and women unmade and was empty of sense. It promised dogs that would eat the balls of every man in Winterfell and declared that Stannis' head would be nailed to the gates at White Harbor. It named men dead who were not and men alive who would ride with him who would not. It was a boy's chest puffed under his father's shadow. Jon folded it, tied it with a string, and hung it above the long hearth. He did not read it to the hall. He did not call Ramsay anything at all. He called men to the walls and named the places where the ice would make ladders more dangerous and burning arrows more useful. He walked the battlements each morning, his boots and ghost's paws leaving the same track side by side. He had the men cut murder holes where walls had made them old, to turn them to use. He had the smiths, such as they had, make grapnels that could catch at ladders and pull them away. He had water hauled to the walls in tubs, and the tubs filled with rocks and oil and whatever else fell to hand that might be tipped down when men below decided to climb. He forbade torches on the walls when the moon was bright, and the men cursed him, and he did not change the order. Ramsay came at dusk on the 7th day after the letter with banners that writhed in the wind like long tongues. A pale, hard storm rode ahead of him and made every step a prediction that men had to correct. The phrase at his side shouted and laughed. They loved their own noise. The Boltons did not laugh. They moved like men who had learned to fight by saving their skins and scaring their neighbors. Behind them wagons creaked, loaded with ladders and with barrels that Jon hoped were full of something other than sap. Ramsay himself rode a black horse with a white patch on its forehead like a finger pointing downward to hell. Jon watched from the tower that had once been called the Broken Tower and felt it steady under his hand. He did not wave. He did not call out. He handed the spyglass to Moore's Umber, who squinted through it with one eye and grunted. "Pretty," he said. "I like a lad who puts his banners crammed all together like a girl bundles flowers. Makes it easier to aim." "Just so," Jon said. He returned to the floor and spoke to Davos and Godry. "We will not waste ourselves on a sally. They will try to goad us into it. Let them burn their own hands on their torches and then try to catch the ashes." He looked to Melisandre and found her looking at him not as a woman looks at a man, but as a priest looks at a flame. "Keep your men from saying prayers instead of watching the wall," he told her. "I do not command their eyes," she said. "Only what they choose to see. Tell them to choose wisely," Jon said, and left her with her smile that was the color of embers. The drums came at night, frays with no rhythm beating on barrels as if trying to drive winter away. Men shouted up from below, curses and threats and promises of new skin to wear. Jon heard them distantly. He told men to keep still and to breathe through their noses and to lay their arrows with patience. Ramsay's boys set torches to their arrows and sent them up like flares to kiss the walls. Some kissed and went out, some found resin. Smoke drifted over the battlements and men coughed and spat black. At the second hour of the night, a cry went up in the east. Ladders. Godry and a half-score with him ran along the inner walk, shields above them, and Jon followed. The first ladder came up clumsily and met the underlip of the parapet and bit. A boy began to climb as if he meant to be first through a door home. Jon slammed the grapnel down and hooked the ladder's third rung and heaved. The boy fell backward into men below, and there were pieces of ladder and men. Another ladder came and another. Oil came down in a black sheet. A man screamed with a sound like a sow taken by wolves. All night it went. A slow, cruel dance of climb and fall, of torch and douse, of men's endurance measured by the emptiness of their wineskins and the stubbornness of their feet. Near dawn the Freys tried the postern by the east gate, where a low fold of ground made a path for goats and courage. Theon's warning had sent Jon there early with men who did not trust themselves to stay awake by will alone. When the Freys came, the Thens were waiting with spears that glowed with frost. They killed quietly and with a kind of mercy, dragging the bodies away before their fellows could trip on them. Jon thought that in a different world, then boys might have been decent soldiers in someone's guard. Ramsay's dogs howled all night in voices that wandered along the curtain wall. Sometimes they sounded like girls screaming. Sometimes they sounded like laughter. Jon stood still and made his heart move at the pace of a deliberate march. He let the sound pass through him as wind through the ribs of an empty BA. At noon the sun broke through a sheer pale curtain of cloud and showed bangs of frost dangling from men's beards and the sheen of ice on the dead where they lay below like thrown dolls. Ramsay drew his lines back and made a show of placing his tents and putting up his pavilions. The Freys played at courage by riding close enough to the wall to put arrows into places a patient man had already learned to leave empty. Jon sent a few arrows back to remind them that the wall was awake. He rationed shafts like bread. That night there was no climbing. Instead the dogs howled and men beat drums and women screamed in the imagination of those who listened. A simple siege weapon. Jon had discovered at the wall that men could stand more cold and hunger than they believed until their minds decided to give them up for lost. He did not let the mind decide. He ordered men to sleep in strict watches. He ordered warm stones to be changed every hour, not because heat in the feet wins a battle, though it might, but because movement in the hall is a beating heart. He fed a pot of broth that never emptied entirely, pouring in whenever he took out. He made the kitchen continue as if a feast were expected, and he watched men's shoulders settle just a little as they listened, even when they laughed at themselves for taking comfort from the sound of ladles on iron. On the fifth day, Ramsay wanted blood. Men do not keep a dog hungry indefinitely. It's their nature to feed it themselves if it does not feed on its own. He led a party at dusk, torches hooded, toward the Sally Gate near the broken tower, knowing because Theon had known, because a boy who had listened while he played the prince had wandered while men with duty sharpened axes. Jon had a dozen men above, their faces blackened with soot. When the latch bar lifted and the door groaned inward, just a finger's breadth, the Freys surged with a baying that might have been their dogs or their own souls. Ghost leaped, white death given form, and a Fry went down with a blood-choked sigh. Jon slammed the bar back into place and planted his shoulder, and the men with him braced their backs against the door, feeling the hammering of bodies on the other side through their spines. Someone on Ramsay's side screamed, "Open, open," and someone else laughed, a dry crackling sound that reminded Jon of burning thorns. Oil poured down through the murder hole and men below shrieked. When the pushing stopped, Jon stepped away and nodded. "Open," he said, and Godry, eyes glittering like a child's when given a new toy, through the bar. They dragged 2 men inside alive and let the rest crawl. One of the men wore a Fry badge on his breast. Jon had him taken to a cell and given water. In the middle of the night, Mor's umber came upon Jon on the wall where the snow had gathered in drifts against the half-battlements. The old man's breath smoked like a steam kettle and his eyes were bright with the kind of joy you see in men who have found something to hit that deserves it. "You fight with your head," Mor said. "I like that almost as much as I like fighting with my hands." He squinted at the camp below, torches moveless in the heavy air. The boy will come himself. He has to. He is built to prove things to other men. When he does, Jon said. We kill him. Hard sentence, Mor said. But true. Jon had never wished for any man's death. Not with enough heat to feel himself charred by the wishing. Ramsay made the wish a quiet thing that did not need heat to keep alive. He wanted him dead because the North could not heal while he lived. He wanted him dead because Theon's hands trembled when he raised a cup of warm tea, and because Jane cried out in her sleep without words. He wanted him dead because the dogs howled like war itself, and he did not want that sound to teach children to speak. Ramsay came to speak on the 7th day, as if some black catechism required a lesson to be given and received then. He came with 2 men at his side, one a Fry whose name Jon did not trouble to learn, names make burdens, and one a Bolton in heavy mail with a face like wet parchment. Ramsay had a face like a handsome boy's after too much time inside where the sun could not touch it. His eyes were bright and set a little too close, and his mouth was not used to kindness. He smiled up at the wall. "Bastard," he called. His voice carried with the clear cut of cold air. "Will you come down and kneel? I'll send you to the wall again when I'm done with your hands." Jon stood above him and said nothing. Silence is a way of speaking. Ramsay's smile sharpened as if he had been told a good joke by a friend who was himself the butt of it. "Shall I call you Stark?" he said, drawing the word out. "Or will you keep the name you earned inside your mother?" He laughed, and the Bolton beside him did not. "I brought a skin for your sister, but she took off without it. I'll stitch you a fine one from your pet." Ghost's lips rippled back from his teeth, and a sound came up from his chest that was old as Pax and Winter both. Jon lifted his wherewithal hand. He did not rest it on Longclaw. He did not toss the answer down like meat. He let the cold talk for him. Ramsay shifted in his saddle, still smiling because he had done it so long it was like a muscle he could not relax. "I'll come tonight," he sang. "I'll come when you are pissing or sleeping or making your prayers. I will come like hunger. Then you will die like hunger dies," Jon said at last, and he did not know he meant to speak until the words hit the air. Ramsay's eyes flashed with an animal's annoyance at a fly that would not stay swatted. He wheeled his horse and threw a glance back like a blade. "You have my bride," he called. "I will have her back and your head besides. Leave her in the yard and I'll give her a quick death. Keep her and I'll teach her your name with a knife." Jon watched him go. The men below with him laughed in the chopped way of men who have been told to. Jon descended the stairs as carefully as an old man, for victory and failure both are slippery, and went to the cell where the Fry they had taken alive paced furiously, and then sat and then sprang up again like a caged dog. He had told them his name already. It had slid off the ear as names for Freys do. "You take orders from a boy," Jon said. The Fry spat at his feet. "From a lord." "You know what kind of lord he is," Jon said. "All the North knows. The river lords will know as well. I will let you go." The man blinked. "With my head. If you carry a message," Jon said, "take it to your uncles and cousins. Tell them this: we will exchange 2 Freys for 2 Hornwood boys. We will exchange 1 Fry for Palla of Wintertown, if she lives. We will exchange 1 for a Glover man. For every man or woman missing a hand or a finger or an ear, we will send you a finger from your own kin." He saw the man's horrified fascination and did not permit himself to look away. "Tell them that if they come to us and put down their banners, we will feed them. If they try to climb again, we will feed them to the Godswood." The Godswood? The Fry tried to be scornful and sounded afraid. "Trees take what is given them," Jon said, "and men's stories grow better when an end is found for them." He let the man go. He watched him ride with 3 other men whose faces were set as if they had been asked to dig their graves and were not sure whether to be grateful for the chance to make them neat. He did not expect mercy. He expected calculation, which is a sort of mercy when men are poor in other currencies. The exchange came, strangely enough. A boy with Hornwood eyes stumbled into the yard and almost fell to kiss the ground. A broken-handed man with a Glover look clenched his jaw so hard it seemed he would crack his own teeth. It was not mercy that returned them. It was arithmetic. The phrase counted ladders and men and wounds and decided one mistake less might be worth a small admission of the other side's humanity. The men they returned were not enough to change the battle's shape. They changed the battle's taste. On the 9th day of the siege, when sleep had become a borrowed thing and men warmed their hands by rubbing them together in the dark, a storm came. Not snow, not wind, but a crack and a roll that made men look to the godswood with memory of summer storms in their heads. Lightning? In winter? No. By the gods, no, it was fire. A pale, low fire flowed along the edge of the camp like water poured, and men shouted and pointed, and then some screamed. The barrels in the Bolton lines had not been pitch. They had been filled with fat and oil and the makings of candles. But candles can light a hope, and they can light doom if you knock them over into the wrong cloth. Someone had knocked them. Someone had dragged a burning tent rope across a line of barrels that had no business being so close. Someone whose name would be forgotten in a generation had done a foolish thing with a torch. "Manderley," Davos said quietly beside John on the wall. "He does not send letters with only words." By the low pale light men fought among the stakes to save their tents and their faces and their pride. The phrase, "God bless their stupidity and their reliance upon stupid men to work off their nerve," swarmed to a fire with noise and no plan. The Boltons put men where men needed to be, and in doing so exposed the seam in their lines where two groups met and did not speak a language of trust. "Now," John said. He had been waiting for the seam since the first drum. They dropped a rope ladder on the north side where the wall's old scar made a shadow. 10 men, then 20, then 30 went over, wildlings and umbers and 2 of the Queen's men who had learned that there is more than one way to fight for fire. They moved in the low light like men under water, silent and certain. They crossed at the seam where men shouted in 2 voices but not at each other. They fell upon a wagon train whose guards were busy beating out a fire that licked a wheel rim like a sly dog. They cut traces and set horses loose and turned wagons into slow, hard-burning torches rolling into other wagons. Then with an axe cut the pin on a wagon so that the back dropped at the perfect instant and spilled grain across fire, making smoke that sent men choking and blind into their own tents. Then they ran, not because they were cowards, but because victory smells like hubris and the quickest way to wash is in the safety of your own wall. Ramsay was not a coward either. He came himself to cut off the retreat, his black horse wild-eyed. He came with 24 dog boys who grinned as if they were at a wedding and 36 men with bright spearheads that winked at the low flame. John watched from the wall and knew this was his moment and that he could let it pass and live like any careful lord and see the battle run another day, or he could take the peace now, pin it and the game with it. He did not remember how he got down the stairs. He remembered only the cold in his bones and the weight of Longclaw in his hand as if it were part of that bone. He went out the East Sally with Moores and Godry and a handful whose names it would be just to remember. Edric of White Harbor, who had smiled once at a joke about eels. Ket of the Wolfswood, who never smiled but had once handed Jane a piece of honeycomb. A then boy with a scar like a river delta near his ear. Ghost went ahead and men made way without knowing they were doing it. They hit Ramsay's men at the seam as one storm hits another, neither more real than the other but one bearing north and the other south. The first man John struck went down as if shocked to find he was mortal. The second turned in time to raise a shield and Longclaw bit wood, and the man's eyes widened over the rim, and then John's boot took him in the belly. He had seen Rob fight once with a grace like a winter deer. He had seen the old bear fight like a bear past summer with a bad leg. He did not fight like either. He fought like a man who had held a wall against dead and living both, and had learned that a companion of patience was ruthlessness, and that mercy is sometimes a sword in the right hand rather than a soft tongue. Ramsay found him because he was looking for him. He came through men as if they were rushes, and his dog boys laughed behind him. He had 2 knives and a short sword and an archer shadowing him like a pet. He slashed a man's face without looking at it to make a path for himself, and then stood with a kind of delighted poise 3 paces away, smiling because he could not stop. The archer lifted a bow. Ghost moved like a thought, and the archer went down with a cry that sounded like surprise more than pain. "You," Ramsay said, and he sounded like a boy who had finally found the stick across which he meant to test his new knife. "Me," John said. and he sounded like a man who did not like words any more than he ever had. Ramsay came light on the balls of his feet, and Jon waited. He had learned that waiting is sometimes movement if the ground is good. Ramsay feinted, cut low, then high with his offhand, a move meant to make a man split in two. Jon turned the high cut aside and stepped into the low as one steps into a wave to break it with your thighs. The knife skittered along his greave and bit leather, and he swore only in the part of his mind that took notes. He cut across with Longclaw in a move that had more in common with a farmer cutting hay than a knight in a tourney, and Ramsay barely got his short sword there in time. Sparks spat. Ramsay laughed. "Sweet boy," he said. "Sweet." Ghost hit one of the dog boys, and Jon saw in the corner of his vision a red spray across snow. He did not let himself be hurried. Ramsay cut again, wicked quick, and the blade kissed Jon's forearm and took a memory there that he would carry to his grave. Pain sharp as a hawk's cry. Jon stepped in, and the pommel of Longclaw found the hinge of Ramsay's jaw with a sound like bone answering bone. Ramsay's head snapped to the side and he staggered. His smile faltered and tucked itself away like a snake when you bring your boot down near it. Jon drove his shoulder forward like a man forcing a stuck door and took Ramsay off his feet. Snow cushioned and betrayed both of them. They went down together in cold that bit through mail. Ramsay was quicker on his back than Jon would have believed. The small knife bit for the gap under Jon's arm where mail gaped to let a man move. Jon twisted and the knife took his ribs instead. A hot line of wet that winter tried to freeze at once. He brought Longclaw up, hilt and blade both. The blade to press, the hilt to break a face, and for a breath saw Ramsay's eyes, not the bright mocking boy's eyes but the animal's. He brought the hilt down hard. There was a crunch that he felt more than heard. Ramsay's head turned again, this time with less eagerness. Jon rolled to one knee and then another, the world going thin at the edges, and found his feet as if they had gone ahead of him. Ramsay came up, wobbling, still smiling because the muscle did not know how not to. He came on with one knife now, and Jon waited for the lunge and gave him instead a kick low in the thigh that made even that smile break. "You?" Ramsay said, not a word this time, only an expelled thought. Jon's return stroke was not pretty. He cut through leather and cloth and skin where a boy becomes a man. Ramsay made a sound like a man whose dog had bitten him. He fell. He did not laugh. He put his hand where the cut was and looked at it as if he had never seen his own blood. It was not over. Men do not die because you have embarrassed them. He scrabbled for the knife he had dropped and found it and came on again, desperate and dangerous now because a wounded animal is both. Jon stepped aside and felt the knife's wind by his ribs. He did not have breath to curse. He brought Longclaw down across Ramsay's wrist, and the knife spun up like a wheeling bird and fell in snow. Then it was simple and terrible. A man on his knees and another standing over him with a sword. The world held its breath. Ghost stood with his chest heaving and red on his muzzle, watching. Jon did not speak words to Ramsay. The words had been spent. He brought the blade down in a stroke that was clean because it was necessary. The head did not leap, because necks are harder than stories say, but life left the eyes like a candle cupped from the wind. He had thought he would feel triumph. He felt only a steadiness, as if a knot that had been tied too long had been worked free and the rope could be used for something again. He stood breathing, watching the steam of it. Godry Faring laughed hoarsely from somewhere to his right, and men shouted a sound like a winter storm hammering a wall. The dog boys broke, and the Freys turned their horses and made for their tents before remembering that tense burn. The Boltons nearest Ramsay's body froze in that instant that always comes after a lord's fall, when a man looks over his shoulder for a new master and sees only sky. Moore's Umber roared, "Take them!" And they did. The rest of the siege did not become easy, but it changed its shape. Fear is a message that runs faster than ravens. By dawn, half the camp belonged to itself and half to no one. The Freys argued in loud voices that told the Umbers exactly where to place their next charge. The Bolton men tried to reform around a heavy man with a pale face who announced himself as Harrion Botley's cousin. No, not that. Names slipped with the noise, but dignity slips on ice when there is no one to hold it steady. White Harbor's small contingent pushed a wedge at the bread wagons. Not because bread was needed, it always is, but because the symbol comes with the sack. Men in the camp tried to make prisoners and found themselves surrounded by a wall of snow and a wall of men who wanted them to be better men than they had been. At noon, a horn blew on the southern road. It blew the way a whale might surface, huge and full of breath. Jon turned to the sound and saw a banner that had been torn and mended and torn again. A crowned stag in black on gold. Stannis Baratheon came up the King's Road with a line of men that moved like a blade pushing through cloth. He had lost many riders in the snow and much of his stoic patience with fortune. But his jaw was set and his eyes were as cold as the air. Behind him rode men from the mountain clans with leather headbands and anger that never got tired. Men from Deepwood Motte who looked at Winterfell with a love that surprised Jon. And a few men whose sigils Jon did not know and Melisandre would later name in a voice like a priest lighting candles. Stannis did not ride into Winterfell like a conqueror. He rode into battle with the look of a man who had arrived on time for something he had scheduled months ago. He clicked his tongue and the line changed shape and closed the camp from the south. The phrase broke properly. Bolton men who would have fought behind their lord's thin smile put down their spears and looked at their feet. Someone tried to run a wagon through White Harbor's men and found a spear in his horse's chest. The horse fell with a sound that reminded Jon of a door ripped from its hinges. By evening, the camp had become an ugly field full of small knots of exhausted men talking in voices too hoarse for boasting. Prisoners knelt with their hands bound, heads lowered. Some wept and some stared with quiet eyes at the snow as if waiting for it to teach them something. Mors Umber brought a fry who cried for mercy in a voice as shrill as a kettle. Davos glanced at Jon and Jon shook his head. "Not by my hand," he said. He meant more than one thing and Davos nodded once. A friend to a man's limits. They brought Ramsay's body on a sledge because winter spares no dignity. His head had been wrapped to keep the flies off, though there were none. The sledge left parallel lines in the snow like a pair of sentences that had not learned to rhyme. The dog boys were dead or scattered. The dogs themselves, leaderless, had run into the wolfswood where perhaps they would learn better masters or die trying. Roose Bolton did not come because of course he did not. That would be a story that ends too quickly. Word came a week later that he had fled to the Dreadfort with a remnant and that the Ryswells and Dustons were saying prudent words about gates and weather. Word also came that White Harbor had eaten a fine pie and judged it good, and that Lord Wyman could look upon his ledger and smile for the first time in a winter's age, though he would not admit it. Word came from the Umbers that Hother had coughed and made a fist, and that the men around him had decided it was wiser to look to Crowfoot's rough cheer than to a chair's creak. Men choose the weather they can bear. Jon stood in the great hall by the restored fire, bigger now, confident flame that knew its chimney and drew properly, and let the warmth touch his face. Stannis stood beside him and did not pretend to love the heat. He simply used it as he used everything. The Red Woman had taken a seat near the far hearth and watched it as if listening to music only she could hear. Alice had taken Jane's hand and was speaking softly to her. Sigorn had agreed to train a dozen boys in the use of the short spear, and his face had softened when an Umber boy had asked a good question. Manderley's knights were sober now that their bellies were full. Godry Faring had a bandage around his head that made him look like a man who had argued with a door. "You have done it," Stannis said, though his tone turned triumph into accounting. "We have held it," Jon said. "Doing is a word that winter makes humble." Stannis's mouth twitched, not unhappily. "You have learned to talk like a lord," he said without quite accusing him of it, "and to fight like a one. Do not let it wet your boots." "I won't," Jon said. He looked at the banners that now hung from the walls. The crowned stag beside the direwolf, because the world had to be made new before it remembered being old. "There is more to do." Stannis nodded. "Always." He turned his head a little. "I sent Davos to White Harbor with letters not written by men who eat too much. He will go on then to places where wolves once ran. When he returns, if he returns, perhaps he will bring you a boy with Rickon's eyes." Jon's breath caught in his throat as if that word were a fishhook. "If he does," he said, and the sentence felt like old wood that could bear weight again. "If he does, I hold this hall for him." "You hold it for me," Stannis said, suddenly iron again. "For the North," Jon said. They looked at each other not as enemies and not entirely as friends. There are alliances that are made of winter, not spring. Stannis looked away first because kings can choose when to do so to make their choice into a fitting thing. For the realm, he said. Mor's Umber slapped Jon on the back hard enough to knock the careful conversation from him. You need a wife, Mor said cheerfully, and a brood of pups that can chew on Umber ankles. Jon, who had thought of Ygritte alone in the cold and of vows and of what it meant to ask a woman to share a hall that might be taken by the dead, smiled without promising anything. Men speak of wives to lords the way they speak of weather to farmers. Both conversations are attempts to make the world stand still. Theon stood alone near a pillar, not far from the fire and yet not of it. His hair had been cleaned. His face still made men look away. Jon crossed to him and Theon flinched and made himself stand anyway. I will die for what I did here, Theon said before Jon could speak. He spoke as if he had meant to hold the words like a hot coal and found them too much to bear. You will die, Jon said quietly. All men do. He did not add sooner, later. He had learned at the wall that time is not a thing for men to pretend to order. But not today. I need your knowledge. And he stopped, not because the words were hard, but because they were important and ought to be placed as a man places a stone where it will not slip. And I am not my father. If there is mercy in me, it is mine. Theon's mouth twisted. Mercy, he said. I used to think it a woman's word. It is a man's word too, Jon said. He did not forgive him. Forgiveness is a thing you do when you mean to drop a burden, and Jon was not done with this one. He put his hand on Theon's shoulder and felt the man tremble like a frightened horse. Stay. Do good where you can. That will not balance a scale. Sometimes scales stay crooked. But we will weigh you as you give us deeds, not as the gods weighed the child you were. Theon closed his eyes and nodded. A jerk of the chin as if his neck had learned heavy lessons and did not like them. In the days that followed, he sat not far from Jane and did not touch her unless she asked. She asked sometimes to hold his hand like a talisman against nightmares. He sat with her then and did not speak, and Jon thought perhaps that counted as part of what he would yet buy, though he did not know against what price. The days lengthened even as winter held. That is the trick of the year. Men forget it. The sun burned higher on the snow and made men squint. Ravens came and went with letters that had more courage in them than the hands that wrote them, because writing is sometimes a braver act than riding. White Harbor sent grain and woodcutters and 2 fine smiths with bellies like small kegs and tempers like summer storms. Deepwood Mott sent a letter in Robert Glover's hand that made Jon's chest ache. The man had been recovered from iron-born hands and wrote of trees he had not thought to see again. Bear Island sent words with paw prints at their edges and promised women who would eat more than they drank and fight more than either. Last Hearth sent boys with fists that did not yet know what to do with swords but would learn. Wintertown stirred. The people who had clustered around Winterfell when the fall winds began to bite now came up into the yard with eyes wide, as if entering a story. They found bunks and shared fires and someone to shout at them about latrines and ration lines, and were comforted by the authority. Children ran in the yard in boots too big for them that slopped and made them laugh. It sounded like something from a summer book. Jon watched the town grow into the castle and the castle grow outward into the town until the distinction felt like a line in a story that had been erased. He slept little and well when sleep came, falling into it the way a man falls into a drift when his knees give. He dreamed sometimes of the crypts and of the stone faces that watched him with eyes that could not see and did. He dreamed of his father turning his head toward him and saying nothing because nothing needed saying. He dreamed of a red woman's hands cupping a fire that did not warm, and of a girl with fierce eyes throwing a knife that always struck where it meant to. He dreamed of a wall of ice that sighed like an old man, and of the sound his sword made when it bit a white where the skin would not give and something else had to. He woke with ghost's breath in his ear and the smell of dog. One afternoon, under a sky the color of old steel, he went down into the crypts. He carried no torch. The boys had done their work and set lamps in iron brackets, and the smell of tallow hung with the dust like a memory of warm kitchens. The statues watched him come, their stone hands on stone swords, the dire wolves at their feet looking like patience carved into something that could hold a hall. Lyanna's statue wore the sorrow she had always worn. Brandon Stark looked like a man who would laugh and then cut your tongue out if you deserved it. Ned Stark had the calm of a river stone. It did not feel like blasphemy to call him Ned in his heart. It felt like the only way to speak to him. Jon knelt and said no words for a time. When he did, he spoke low, as if the stone had ears only for whispers. "I have held it," he said. "I have put the wolf on the wall again. Men came and kneeled and stood, and some died. I killed a boy who liked to cut men the way boys cut bacon rind. It did not taste like I imagined. There is more to come. I will not leave it to Stannis. I will not leave it to any man whose heart beats for a crown before it beats for the North." He touched the cold stone of his father's hand. "They call me Stark," he said. "It feels heavy, but right. If Rickon comes, if he comes and the gods smile, I will make him a hall and teach him where the wind finds a man's back. I will give him brothers where he has none. I will be a bridge instead of a wall. If he does not come, I will see the North through this winter. I will keep the dead beyond until men learn to be something other than children with knives." The stone said nothing, and Jon took comfort from that, as he always had. Words can be lies. Silence is a kind of honesty. He came up into the Godswood and found Sansa there in his imagination. For a moment. No, not Sansa, a girl standing with a steel spine and a wary eye on the world. The thought of her. He shook it away. The heart tree stood with snow in its higher branches and red tears frozen into little hard beads. He put his hand there and felt again that pulse which might have been his or might have been Winterfell's. He thought of Bran somewhere far to the north or beyond it, a boy walking in places where only ravens fly. He thought of Arya, whose name had come to his hall with a lie attached. He thought of her knife-quick grin and wished a safe harbor for her that he did not believe in. He thought of the wall, its great pale face turned to the night, and of the shadows that moved there that were not men's shadows. Winterfell was not salvation. It was a refuge and a rallying place and a heart. Hearts are not swords. They beat and bleed and hold and can be broken. He meant to let this one beat a long time. When spring came, if spring came, men laughed differently when they said it now. It would not bring gentleness with it. There would be reckonings. Frays to answer, Boltons to root out like rats in a granary. Men who had cut throats for thin lies, who would need to be shown that small lies do not build houses. But the North had remembered itself. The old words that had felt like frost on the tongue tasted like bread again. On an evening when the sky went purple and the first stars fought through the cold air with tiny knives of light, Jon stood on the wall and watched smoke rise from Wintertown in slender strands. He had lived here as a boy, in a shell of a place that had been kept for him like a crumb. He lived here now as a man, and the castle felt like a thing that consented to him rather than a thing he had taken. Ghost leaned against his leg and sighed in his way that always reminded Jon of the old bear when he had set down a weight. Below, men boiled pitch because there would always be someone to pour it on. A woman sang in the hall because there would always be some song, however poor. A boy practiced a cut with a wooden sword, and his face was serious as a book. A raven left the rookery and wheeled against the wall, a scrap of black sowing the pale air, and flew away along a path that the heart sees before the eye. Jon watched it go and felt the season itself, long and blank and cruel, turn in its sleep. Stannis came to stand beside him with a rustle of wool and a smell of cold iron. They looked out together without speaking for a long time. "Your men grow used to you," Stannis said at last. "They grow used to the hall," Jon said. "I am a voice it currently uses." Stannis snorted. "Do not let the hall become your excuse. Men lead men, not stones." "Stones remember," Jon said, and Stannis gave him a narrow look that could mean approval or an invitation to stop talking about things he could not hammer. "Davos writes," Stannis said. "White Harbor sets its hooks in needed places. Your boy with the red hair." "Wex," Jon said. "Wex says that a small boy went east with a wildling woman and that a wolf walked beside them. Davos has gone to fetch him. If he brings him back, you will have done a good thing." Jon looked down at Longclaw's pommel, the bear's head with its eyes of smoke. It had been a Mormont blade that had chosen him as much as any man had. He laid his hand on it and felt the roughness that his own fingers had put there. "If he brings him back, I will rejoice," he said. "Until then, I will mend doors and measure grain, and set spears in boys' hands the right way up." Stannis's mouth tipped. "And kill the men who need killing," he said. "It is a long list," Jon said, and in the saying of it there was no boasting and no regret. Spring was not near. The wind had that clean edge that made noses run and eyes water. The snow would fall again. Men would die who had done nothing but stand in the wrong place and listen for too long. The dead watched from beyond the wall, and Jon felt them sometimes as a kind of pressure at the back of the skull. But the hall was warm. The kitchen sang. The gods would listen. The north had a place to turn its face that was not a knife. He could build from that. He would. That night he walked the hall after the men had gone to their benches and the fire had grown thoughtful. He went to the chair at the far end that had never been a throne and sat. He did not sit long. He did it so that his body would remember the weight and decide not to crave it. He rose and laid a hand on the wood and felt under the polish the dents and scars left by men's lives. He thought of Ned's hands and of Robb's easy laugh and of Lyanna asleep forever on her cold bed and of Rickon perhaps on a rock waiting to be told his own name by someone who would not shape it into a mockery. He thought of Arya a wolf in a girl's skin and of Bran walking paths that men cannot find with their feet. He thought of Sansa in some southern hall, learning to live with men whose words slid like eels. He thought of himself, Jon Stark by decree and by need and by the old worth of a house that had always understood winter. He went out into the yard. Ghost followed, his footsteps making no sound on the hard snow. The sky was a vault full of cold stars. He breathed, and his breath came back to him as fog. He put a hand on Ghost's ruff and the dire wolf leaned his head against Jon's hip, a weight that grounded rather than tethered. He looked up at the wall. It did not glow or groan. It was simply there, a thing put by men to stand and stand and stand until either it fell or they all did. He took off his glove and pressed his bare palm to the black stone of the inner keep for a moment, as if to warm it. The stone chilled him. He took a kind of savage comfort in the honesty. "Winterfell," he said softly, and the word did not so much echo as enter the stones and remain. He was not sure to whom he spoke, to the hall, to his father, to himself, to a world that needed a name to say back at the darkness. The wind did not answer. The quiet did. He let it. He stood there a long time, a man with his sword and his wolf and his hall, and when he went in again the kitchen pot still bubbled and the small noises of a living keep went on around him, as steady as breath. In that sound there was promise. It was not the promise of spring. It was older than that and more sure. It was the promise of a fire that would not go out while men tended it, and of men who would stand while they could and then be remembered by others who would stand. It was enough. Days came like stones thrown into water and made their rings. Some days had a shout at the gate and the clatter of hooves. Others had the quiet labor of mending harness and teaching a boy to cut bread without slicing his thumb. Letters arrived and were read and answered. None had the letter that would end a quest. Stannis came and went a dozen times, all iron and impatience and purpose, wearing down resistance as the sea wears down a cliff, not in an hour but in the relentless work of days. Men in patches came to the yard and knelt under banners and rose with winter in their eyes, and Jon listened to them and put them where they fit, which is what a lord does most of all. Snow fell. Fire burned. The dead kept their own counsels beyond the wall, and when they came, as they must, the north would send men and fire north again because the hall beat and the men in it had remembered their name. Ghost hunted. The gods would listen. Jon slept and woke and walked the walls, and he kept a hand always on Longclaw when the night was deep, not for fear of Ramsay, who would trouble the north no more, but for love of the living. In time, word would come of a ship taken into the teeth of rock, and a boy with a shag of dark hair and eyes as wild as weather who was brought ashore in a skin of nets and stubbornness. In time, word would come of a girl with a needle who had learned to thread it through the world and come out where she meant to. In time, word would come of kings made and unmade and of fires that burned not in hearths but on fields. But that was a chapter not yet written. This one ended in the steady glow of Winterfell's hall and in the slow, sure nod of men at table, and in a man standing under the dark and seeing the light that did not dazzle but endured. Jon breathed the cold and tasted it as something he had earned, and at his side Ghost lifted his head and watched the same stars that had watched their father and his father's fathers. The North held. That was the story now, and all the stories that came after would have to begin with that.